In today's fast-paced, chaotic world of modern technology, scientific advances, and instant information, what does it matter that 500 years ago, a lone monk, armed with his 95 church grievances and theological arguments, would ignite what would be called the Reformation? The more we look and the deeper we dig, we find the impact of that day surrounding us more than we may realize. Church worship changes drastically as a result of Martin Luther.
And leading up to the Reformation, the congregation wasn't really participating in the divine service. The liturgical leaders were the ones that were leading the entire service. And so the people would gather in the congregational space and just stand there and watch. The congregation was not participating in the service at all.
When somebody came to Mass, it was more than likely spoken in such a way that the person who was in the pew didn't really hear what was said.
Luther somewhere says faith is an acoustical affair, which is a nice translation of it. Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word, and so on.
He tried to bring the music back into the congregational life. So music was part of worship life in the late Middle Ages, but was often conducted by the choirs. And often in Latin. So Luther replaced all of the main parts of the Mass with hymns that the congregation could sing, hymns in German.
To give the voice to the people was really a radical thing.
But in many ways, Luther created what many called the singing church.
Attending worship services changes from merely watching to actually participating.
Well, you were a spectator under the low Mass that he inherited. And you did your personal devotions. When he got done doing the German Mass, you weren't a spectator, you were actually a participant. It was about engaging the people and using the gift of music.
Music is teaching quite a bit of what's happening in people's devotional life. And music is a folk tool, sung at home. Music sustains the day. Music is sung socially. Music, just like in our day, music has a profound impact on the people in that day.
Now, the advantage of a hymn was that it could help their memory for what the church really taught, and therefore the gospel was put into the songs so that the average person, by repeating this week after week sometimes, would be strongly inserted into their memory in a memorable way because it was attached to a tune.
Luther designed those hymns initially to be sung both in the congregation but especially at home.
Participation in other parts of the service is introduced as well.
They would participate in the Lord's Supper rather than just seeing it being performed in front of them.
Communion is a huge issue in the Reformation, both in what it means theologically and adjoined to that people's participation or lack thereof of it.
Just the notion that people who gather to worship should be singing is rooted in some of the basic principles of Luther's reforms.
Except for certain musical styles, how we worship today differs little from what developed during the Reformation. The upheaval of the political system during the Reformation is clearly evident, and the effects are still prevalent. Luther's message is for a faith more personal and the individual conscience, not coerced by either church or state. With the flow of money switching from the church into the hands of the government, the relationship between the church and the state is revised. And we cannot forget the religious wars and violence in the name of religion, evident in the 16th century, and yes, today too. Before the Reformation, violence is not always considered evil, but sometimes a means to a righteous end.
Today, I think most Christians in the Western world are in agreement that violence is inherently evil, and Christians should not resort to violence. That's always sort of a last resort. It's not what we would choose to do, although there may be times where we need to use violent means. But we would certainly not want to use violence in the cause of religion and for specifically religious purposes. That's a view that comes about after the Reformation. Prior to that, the understanding is a bit different in that people understood, and this goes back to late antiquity, understood violence as in itself neutral morally. What made violence good or bad was the end that it served. And so violence in terms of resisting correcting evil was seen as a good thing, and this extended to religious goals, religious ends, and holy wars. That changes with the Reformation. There are a number of incidents within the Reformation, culminating in the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, that caused Europeans to reject violence in the name of religion. The suffering of these wars, especially the 30 Years' War, was so great that there's just general agreement that we should not do this anymore.
But Christian history is not a good record at all on nonviolence, and the Reformation didn't improve it. It got a 30 Years' War out of it, and we still try to make sense of that. Everybody's just killing everybody in the name of God. Protestants will link with other Protestants to kill Catholics. Catholics will link with other. It's just all over the place.
Luther always thought that the church should do without warfare and power and violence. He was clear about this from the beginning. In fact, early on in the Reformation, some knights in the empire offered to lead a rebellion in his name and for his cause, and he politely declined that. He was never interested in that sort of a reformation. And that also colors his reaction to the Peasants' War, where you have this series of peasant uprisings that ultimately becomes a full-scale war or rebellion or whatever you want to call it, with the peasants at least in part claiming justification in Luther's understanding of Christian freedom. And they claim to be rebelling in Luther's cause.
Does Luther's teaching contribute to the peasants' revolt? Well, yeah, it does. Luther's devastated by that reality and doesn't like it, but it does. I mean, it's one of these kind of unfortunate side effects. People take the freedom they have and they run with it. This is what Luther discovers in the Saxon visitation. You know, have people misuse the freedom they've been given? Oh yeah, bummer.
He had always said very clearly that Christians ought to support the government. And if there's a conflict between what the government is doing and what you think should be done, you simply have to suffer the consequences then.
By the end of the 17th century, the use of violence has become something to be avoided.
There are certain incidents within the Reformation that bring violence into question. A good example is within the Anabaptist or Mennonite tradition. If people know anything about Mennonites today, they'll know that they are absolutely pacifist. They will not serve in the military. That came about as a result of a more violent movement within Anabaptism in the 16th century, where you had radical apocalyptic preachers proclaiming that the city of Münster was going to be the site of Christ's coming in the New Jerusalem. And Anabaptists flocked to Münster. Eventually the city was put under siege and taken and conquered, and numerous people were slaughtered. But the result of that led to the formation of this completely peaceful strain of Anabaptism, and that's what we know today as Mennonites. I think one of the challenges today is we're put in the position in our country, we're given a great deal of freedom to speak and decide for ourselves on things. And we have the challenge of deciding whether we believe a war is just or not.
War and violence is a struggle at the time of the Reformation. It remains a struggle today. The era of the Reformation is a tumultuous time, with religious reform often used as a catalyst for revolution. Luther's freedom of the individual conscience becomes an excuse to defy all manner of authority and fight for causes political, economic, and social. Tyranny and tolerance, virtue and violence could all be justified by religious convictions, but the 16th century is also marked by attempts to argue for political resistance on its own terms. Conflicts are not unique to any age, but the battles fought then have shaped our modern world, even in a country that once fought for its own freedom and independence. Following the Middle Ages, people seek the means for revolt against the tyranny of the times.
Luther believed that princes, dukes, city councils, those in positions of authority, were there to serve the people. They were not there for their own benefit, for their own aggrandizement. They were there to enhance the lives of the people they ruled. And so you find Luther and his fellow reformers admonishing ruling authorities to do a good job, to take care of infrastructure, to take care of the poor, not to cheat people, not to waste people's tax money. Ruling authorities were to be in service to the people.
The reformers speak out against the spiritual tyranny of the church, but some, like Martin Luther, struggle with the writings of the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, chapter 13.
Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience.
In the early 1520s, Frederick the Wise actually asked the Wittenberg professors whether he could use his armed forces as a prince of the empire against the emperor, should the emperor crack down on Lutherans. Nicholas von Amsdorf, the nobleman, said, well, of course, he's an elected emperor, and he was elected by the electors like Frederick the Wise. He's subject to their discipline. Johannes Bugenhagen and Philip Melanchthon were more moderate. Melanchthon liked the argument that if there's notorious injury, there's a kind of natural law right to defend yourself and whatnot. And Luther said, no, you simply have to suffer for the faith. This led to a kind of crisis for him because governments were persecuting the evangelical faith, and even the House of Habsburg, the imperial house, burned two of his fellow Augustinians and launched the whole story of martyrdom in the Reformation period.
In his writing on the freedom of a Christian, Luther writes parallel statements. The first statement,
A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none.
This statement gains great popularity, while the second statement,
A Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all.
This receives less attention from the masses.
The peasants' revolt, the enthusiasts of the 1520s very quickly disillusioned him, that in fact, left to themselves, people will not only take the truths of the gospel, but will uphold them without a whole lot of help from the magistrate and from the clergy. So Luther was disillusioned at that point.
In 1530-31, when after the Augsburg Confession was given to the emperor and rejected by the emperor, Charles V, and then there was the threat that April 15th, 1531, you guys are back under Roman obedience, or we're going to come with our troops.
When the Smalcaldic War finally came, Charles V was not entirely successful in snuffing out Lutheranism, even in controlling territory. When he's there with troops, people will fall in line. When he leaves, well, the evangelical preachers, the Lutheran preachers may come back. But what is clear is that he may be able to control the territory, but he can't control the hearts and the minds. And people have learned their catechisms, their little booklets at home.
Luther started to rethink his position. So in his warning to his dear Germans, he actually is edging toward what became more explicit in the late 1530s, a theory based on his understanding of Christian vocation. If the emperor is not fulfilling his vocation properly, then he has forfeited the right to complete obedience. And not anybody on the street can resist, but the princes of the empire can resist. In part, that was due not to his theological convictions, but to a constitutional argument. It's a matter of calling, and the princes have the calling to keep the emperor in line. And that idea then influenced some of his followers who resisted Charles V after the Smalcald War in the city of Magdeburg. And in 1550, pastors there drew up a confession, which was a confession of faith, but then also argued for the right to resist the suppression of the gospel, also with armed force, as Magdeburg was actually doing. It was a city under siege.
Within the confession is a direct response to the Romans 13 passage.
Yes, political authorities were appointed by God to do good. But if they are not doing good, then they could not have been appointed by God. Yes, we must render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. But if Caesar wants or takes what is God's, then we must withhold or retrieve it for God's sake. Yes, he who resists the authorities resists God. But if the authorities resist God, then surely we must avenge God's honor.
The Magdeburg Confession became a well-known document. It was written in German and in Latin, and particularly in the city of Geneva, as the French government continued to persecute the followers of Calvin in France. Theodor Beza, for instance, Calvin's right-hand man, picked up the ideas of the Magdeburg Confession. And then from Beza, it goes clearly into the 17th century work on resistance that led the Puritans to justify their revolt against Charles, the Stuart government, and resulted then in the Commonwealth. But even before that, people like John Ponnet or Ponnet, I'm never sure how he actually pronounced it in the 16th century, an English clergyman, an English theologian and bishop. He's a good example of how already in the 16th century, when Mary Tudor, the so-called Bloody Mary, began to persecute Protestants in the 1550s, Ponnet and others picked up on the Magdeburg Bekenntnis, or confession, and used it to formulate their own theories of resistance.
This gave people the basis for what they consider righteous resistance against the government.
The English had a revolutionary tradition that was really based on common law and the lack of right of tyranny, we might say. No tyrant could be tolerated in human society. People among the early Puritan movement in England already were picking up on the Magdeburg Confession, which reflects Luther's understanding that there's an argument to be made from the calling of the emperor to serve the common good, and when the government doesn't serve the common good, resistance is possible.
As the American colonists consider resistance against England, Poynant's teachings influenced the likes of John Adams, forming a basis for the American Revolution in 1776.
John Adams was a very devout Christian, and he wanted to root his theories of resistance for the American Revolution in Christian sources. And Ponnet's argument was rooted in the theories of resistance all the way back to the Reformation. So John Adams recommended Ponnet. In fact, in his treatise on the Thoughts of Government, he repeated the basic tenets of resistance that we find in Ponnet. What John Adams didn't realize was actually how deeply rooted this argument was in the Lutheran tradition and even in the ideas of Luther himself.
Today, our idea of a just war is traced along this path back to the days of the Reformation.